Okay, I think it's just about time. Good morning, at least it's morning here in Austin. Good afternoon or evening, whatever is appropriate for where you are joining us. I'm Chance Coble, and this is another Ask Me Anything. Ask Me Anything format. If you haven't attended one of these before, we open up a topic specifically around data and business intelligence, and then we usually open it up for any questions that you have, you want to bring about Yellowfin, about your business intelligence deployment, and it's just kind of an office hour type arrangement where you get to ask anything you want about our experience, our advice and opinions about doing these kinds of deployments and anything you might be challenged with. So I'm Chance Coble. I am with Blacklight Solutions, which is a partner of Yellowfin for about 15 years now. Most of my focus has been in Yellowfin deployments, specifically in embedded deployments, helping companies gain some kind of analytics competency in the software they're deploying to their clients by leveraging Yellowfin's features and providing those analytics. Through a tool like Yellowfin, which saves them a lot of development effort often and eases up their deployment. Today's topic is about alerts, signals, and data monitoring. So I'll dive into this topic. I'm excited about it because I think it's some pretty low-hanging fruit for a lot of companies in their approach to business intelligence and how they stay on top of their data. There we go. So to start out here, a lot of times we need to ask ourselves, and it's one of the first questions I pose when I begin a new consulting adventure with a new client. What is keeping you from growing? What are your bottlenecks? Where are you trying to go next in terms of being able to scale? And then I like to tie that down to what are the questions we really need to answer in order to address those growth challenges? And then further, what can we do to really systematize and automate that based on the data that we're seeing? The fact is, most clients respond to me that 95% of this organization in these ways that we often want to automate or systematize can be run by monkeys. But everybody's here for that other 5%. It's that 5% that requires all the skills that we have in-house. It's that 5% that really is the greatest risk and uncertainty of activity that we do here in the business. And I would argue that in many cases, that 5% really represents the opportunity and the low-hanging fruit when we want to start systematizing, monitoring, and understanding data, or getting it to us in a way that we can actually make decisions on it. And that's really my focus in the topic today. Sometimes when we start looking at that 95%, we think, well, this is easy, so let's turn it over to AI. But the fact is, AI, while it has obviously made some great strides in recent years, it is still a very complex proposition to plug into the enterprise. That's not a bad thing. It's just an upfront investment, and you have to be ready for that. You have to be able to have a team that understands those technologies, understands how to integrate them into the enterprise, and understands how to really get business value out of them. What I'm going to talk about today is some lower hanging fruit that I think is still requires that level of intelligence, but glues into the enterprise and is a great first step to really getting a lot of value without necessarily getting into that upfront investment. What I'm really kind of after here is, if you can kind of think of the "you are here" point on your map with automation and how you're approaching it, can you get to a point where you really see that your deployments are simple applications that can be immediately achievable, immediately being sometime in the next few months, so that you're getting business value out of them. And as you start to learn from that success, I think at that point, it's a great time to start really looking at more complex deployments. A lot of organizations haven't taken that first step yet, so I don't necessarily recommend they go to the most complex cutting edge technology first, but practice getting some success first. Practice maximizing that ROI, getting that return out of anything you can do, and that means really finding that low-hanging fruit that's going to minimize some of your upfront investment. When you do, you start structuring those conversations around that 5% of uncertainty, with everything else being systematized as being, that's an area where if we knew about things earlier, then we might be able to get a lot more return on whatever investment we make there. It seems complex and daunting, but I'm going to show you some techniques today that will actually make it, I think, quite a bit simpler. So maximizing that ROI, you start thinking about in that 5% of the things we don't know in that 5% or other things that surprise us in that 5% that we'd really like to see some automation around. How much do we need to be looking at? And that's going to be a question of our throughput. And how quickly do we need to know that something has changed or done something unexpected, or in some way our business has behaved in some kind of weird fashion we just need to be apprised of and potentially is going to drive a business decision. That's the latency. Throughput is how much we got to look at. Latency is how quickly we need to know about the update. So in order to motivate this, I'm going to start off by telling a little bit of a story when I came to see the importance of this and just how many organizations really haven't taken this very first step, I think, in automation and in using intelligence to really stay on top of what their business does. Now, I'll talk about a business that's very data heavy. I think this applies to most of the clients I work with today in some form or fashion. Most clients, once you have some kind of sufficiently interesting business, you almost certainly have a set of records coming through that business, whether it's in finance, which is very naturally quantitative, operations, which are a little behind finance, but certainly have a lot of quantities around them. KPIs are becoming much more common, monitoring those KPIs, all the way out to sales and marketing, which are very much numbers driven. As of 2024 and have become more so decade by decade. And that's in addition to all of the products you can create for your customers, especially if you're one of these services firms that is going in and analyzing through some specific set of practices that you've created for your clients and doing that consultation around that analysis. That's an area where you can put monitoring into place and really create a lot of value and potentially even a sellable product. So let's rewind all the way back into 2012 when I get a call from a telecommunications company. Now, to start out, a lot of you who haven't maybe worked in telecommunications, it's a fairly esoteric enterprise. So I'll say this very simply. They were a wholesaler in the telecommunications industry. So the job of this firm was essentially to access network routes that they could terminate calls to, the destination of the call. And when somebody would make a call, they essentially became a customer of this firm. They would make the call, and completely under the hood, without the caller knowing about it, the underlying infrastructure would buy routing from this company. And this company then simply turned around and looked to vendors and how to route that call and would purchase that usage on the fly. So it would take incoming calls, and these become customer routes, and turn around and buy vendor routes in order to complete the call. And ideally, they're charging more than they're paying that vendor. And as a result, the call gets completed profitably, and they take a little bit of a margin. And they're doing this, probably 100 million times a day at the size of telecommunications company they were. And so the key thing for these guys is that margin is managed by the cost of the routing that they're purchasing. However, there's a caveat. You have to make sure that the quality of the routes that you're buying is high enough so that you're not going to drive down your business because people start to associate you with low quality calls. So you have to make sure that in the process of doing all of this selling of the routes and then turning around and connecting them with their destination, which is your vendor, which you're paying, that you're doing that in a way that maintains the quality of the route while also minimizing that cost. And there's a lot of thinking and analysis that goes into this. The piece of it that I was called about was that these guys had recently become very frustrated because as these things change and evolve and start to see drift in data to higher or lower values, suddenly there would be a network disruption and they wouldn't be aware of it, and they would continue to route calls into the disruption until somebody figured out what was going on and where it was. So this was a very reactive model of a customer phone call comes in, and this all has to happen sub-second. The switch determines what route it's going to take, and it gets, buys the usage essentially on that route. And if it was routing them to a disrupted network, then they have a bad experience with the call, or it doesn't terminate, or they wind up getting a busy signal or whatever. So all of this means that they wanted better decisioning around what that switch was going to be doing, so that if they have suddenly a vendor that goes down or starts to have some real issues around their quality, that they could make a change to their switch so that that vendor is taken out of route until the issue is corrected. That's really most of what they needed to do. Sometimes it required further analysis. Now, all the while, this seemed like kind of an annoying issue, and sort of sat in the background, and they thought about ways to make their routing more profitable and thought about ways to make this more kind of real time. And they had looked at some different custom coded data applications, but it all just seemed too daunting. And then one day in late summer of 2011, they had kind of a wake-up call on being ignorant around this, when there was a medium-sized earthquake that struck in Virginia and then wound up disrupting some of the infrastructure in the Northeast, in addition to loading up call networks. Because as soon as it happened, people were so surprised by this. Everybody jumps on their phone, everybody's taking pictures, everybody's uploading pictures to Facebook, and they're starting to really take up the network. And they had no idea what was happening until eventually they caught up with it on the news, and they were able to backtrack this explanation into something that was specific to the Northeast, and they could then go identify routes that were still open and available that they could route their customers to. Cost them a lot of money that day, and they decided enough is enough, and that's when they actually called me, and they searched around for a solution to this. And I'll talk to you about how I solved this problem, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about the specific solution. So let's pop into Yellowfin for a minute. There we go. We should now see a Yellowfin instance. Now, for those of you who may not have used Yellowfin before, or may not be familiar with the platform, I'll just quickly introduce it. Yellowfin is an entirely web-based business intelligence tool. Once it's instantiated, you log into it, you can connect to data sources. It's a market leader in the management of metadata and how you structure queries on top of your database so that they can be collaborated on and shared and democratized across an organization through this one server-based web interface. So having said all that, what I want to do here is talk through how we might take a report where in the example of my telecommunications company, we have data coming in, we have probably a lot of time series we need to stay on top of, and we don't want to do any programming, but we'd really love to know how exactly can we take that time series data and then turn that into some kind of notification in the event of a disruption. So I'm going to start out going into my favorites here, and I've got a chart on some sales around the holiday season. So this is a different domain, and this is actually around publicly available liquor sales. This is a demonstration example. If you've seen me give a demo, you've probably seen some of this data before, where we're looking at spikes and dips in sales. And what I first want to introduce here is, if you go into this broadcast icon, if you've used Yellowfin and you haven't seen this icon or played with it a little bit, I recommend it. And you can go in and start to create these new types of broadcasts. So here we're going to do a general broadcast, although we could do something like a smart task where it drops this on our timeline or drops this on some delegated individual's timeline and sets it up as something they have to resolve. We could do a personal broadcast where it simply sends a message to us over email. And then we could also do an FTP schedule where we actually take this report, export it in a given format, and send it up to an FTP server for some kind of file-based analysis. But here we're going to do a traditional broadcast, which is actually just sending out this as an email. And I recommend considering, a lot of people like to export these into CSVs or Excel documents or PDFs. But really consider sending it out as a link back to Yellowfin. The benefit of that is when your email goes out and says something about what's going to happen, and you can enter that here in the subject and the body of your message, it links to Yellowfin, so the person's prompted to click on that link, come back to Yellowfin, and then they get all the interactivity with the tool, and they get the live view of the data, as opposed to a snapshot that was taken, possibly overnight or depending on what the schedule was. Now, it's not that innovative necessarily to have schedule-based report send outs. I think that if I stopped there, I'd be, really short of what that telecommunications company was looking for. But just to go through the features, fundamentally, we start out here looking at what granularity of time we want to run this on. I'd like to run this, say, daily. I could run it every 5 minutes. And then I pick the time of day when this is going to run, and this goes off and runs. But the fun happens when I set this as an alert. When I set this as an alert, I'm able to go into the alert rules and say if any of the records matches a logical rule, if the entire data set matches a logical rule, in other words, if I sum for a particular sales amount growing beyond a value or staying under a value, I want to be emailed about that. But in most relevant to what we're talking about here, if the latest date available in the time series report, and we pick the date here, has this criteria, then send me an email. So every day this is going to run, or every 5 minutes this is going to run, or whatever we want. And I can pick sales amount here and say if the sales amount ever grows, let's just say greater than, for one time period, $1 million, then I would want to know about that because that's something weird in my data, and I want to come back to this report and take a look at what's going on, or possibly filter it to understand it better and get some context. Once I submit that, and the rule is applied, I can submit here, and now I have the rule in text, and I get to send my report out, and starting immediately, every day or every 5 minutes, or again, whatever granularity I've set, this is going to run, it's going to check against that rule, and if that rule is a logical match, then it will send out the report prompting me to come back to Yellowfin and do this analysis. Okay, so that's pretty interesting when we talk about hard thresholds, fixed dollar amounts. But a lot of times what we're interested in is a more statistically based change, maybe something based on a percentage of what the last one was. And in order to do that, I'm going to go copy this report and just walk through how simple something like that is. Now, I don't want to do this for every product and for every category here. I want to actually just look at the total number, total amount in sales. I can apply filters to this if I want, of course. If I want to look at a specific product, but I want to know simply date by date what is going on here. And I'm going to use Yellowfin's advanced functions really quick. And there's an advanced function defined for deviation from previous, which will give us the percentage change from the prior record to the current record, based, of course, on the sorting that we've applied, which is from the early date to the latest date, earliest date to the latest date. So now, once I have this set, and just to be complete here, I don't want this to be a numeric. I want it to be a percentage so that it's properly formatted when I look at it. Now I've got the percentage change from one record to the next. So this went from 944,000 to 970,000, and we see that change here. All the way up to positive and negatives changes. Looks like we have a big one here around 28%. We could graph this in addition to graphing that if we wanted, but today we're here to talk about notifications, so let's take a look at that. This is a very basic kind of period comparison from one to the next. And once we have that in place, and we've got that additional number available in the report, I can go back now into this broadcast. And I can, again, set it for linking back to Yellowfin. But when I set my alert, the most important piece of this is now if I'm setting it for that latest date, I'm asking for the latest date to come in. If you can check this on a regular basis, this deviation should not be between, let's say, negative 30%, it'll be 0.3, of course, to positive 30%. So if it drops more than 30% or it grows more than 30% from the second to last value, I want to know about that. And of course, because we formatted it as percentage, you'll see that even though we put 0.3 in, which is the numeric value, it formats it for us so that we can verify that we're actually looking at anything that drops more than 30% or grows more than 30% is actually going to notify us. And this is just a question of the granularity of time we run this on. So that's fundamentally how I solve the telecommunications problem. I'll get back to that in a second. Once we pop out of this, I'll just let you know for context in the interest of making sure everybody's fully educated on what we're doing here. When you go in to set this kind of stuff up, or you want to get after these reports, make sure you go into this email tab in the admin configuration, and you go ahead and set up your email server. I don't think I have one set up for this, but you would want to set your, from your IT admin or whatever, get your SMTP settings. You log into that email server so that you can use those emails, that email notification through that email server, and then just as importantly, go in, especially if you're sending this out to any third parties, and set up your email branding. This is essentially a WYSIWYG environment where you can go in and set your header images, your text, different fonts, whatever. Set it to be according to your style guide so that when those emails go out, they actually look like your brand. They look like something entirely generated by your organization. And that's especially true if you're sending this out as a product to customers, where not only can you send this out in a branded fashion, but you can actually change it if you have a multi-tenant deployment of Yellowfin. You can go into each tenant and set customizations to their brand of emails that go out. So it could include, say, the client logo or something like that. Okay, so to land this plane on what happened for the telecommunications company and to open up a new topic here, the solution I put together with Yellowfin was to do exactly what I just showed you. And then I decided to evolve that a little bit because I had a couple of key challenges. One is I didn't know if a number sometimes had a likelihood of growing or dropping 30%. It actually depended a lot on the underlying volatility of that number. If it was a very noisy number, then 30% may not have been a very good boundary. If it was a very quiet number, it might have been needed to be tighter so that I'm only looking at an 8% deviation from one point to the next. I didn't know that for all the data, and that would have been a tremendous amount of work to analyze all of that. So one technique that I brought to them was to use a custom implemented advanced function that would actually take a look at the recent variance of the data, and it would set the thresholds accordingly. And I thought this was very clever. I was very proud of this work. And you can see here, this is actually a live measure of some of their call detail record throughput and qualities, where you see in this measure, what happens is it's popping around in green a little bit here, and these dynamic thresholds are set around it, squeezing it when it gets very quiet, but getting wider as it becomes noisier. And when this changes a great deal, you wind up getting some kind of a flag, and you can adjust the thresholding around how forgiving or how tight this boundary is around the number that it's governing. And then you get an alert anytime you get one of these lines here. And so I use this as an example when there was some kind of a quality disruption on a particular trunk group, which is a category of lines, then you wind up seeing this. So I started out with Yellowfin Alerts, and then I moved to something much more like this. And I was much happier with the results here because this is a more holistic look at these key metrics. However, even though this did provide the notification through email, it was a good kind of holistic approach, and I didn't need to know much about the number before I started monitoring it. There were still a lot of numbers to monitor. And even when you did get something that was an alert here, all I did was show you this report, and you could go in and filter it around and take a look at it and maybe develop an insight into what was going on. But in this case, you were not able to simply get free context with what was happening. So we had a couple of key challenges, even though I think this was a lot of progress for them, one of which was being able to slice it up by every dimension, and then also being able to provide that context. So being able to scale further really means finding something that is a really productized solution, which could be generally applicable, which would solve some of those problems. This quote at the top about it, it's not the things you don't know that trip you up, it's the things you think you know but don't. By the way, this is a related quote to a quote you might have seen at the beginning of the movie The Big Short by Mark Twain, that was something like, it ain't the things you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's the things you know for sure that just ain't so, I think was the quote. But I couldn't attribute it to Mark Twain. I couldn't actually find, where he said that. I think it may actually be a misattribution, which is terribly ironic for the point the quote was making. But I went with a more contemporary author, and I can actually cite this. So that's the quote I'll put here. But it really is, I think, appropriate to point out that what we're really trying to do is find out what we think is normal about our business, but has actually become weird without us noticing it. And being able to do that and do it across all numbers and do it with context in our analysis so we can make an evidence-based decision about what to do next when we arrive at that conclusion, that's really what we're after. And so in this case, we're really getting to talking about some more extensive data monitoring, and this is where Yellowfin Signals is going to come in. So we're looking for a holistic approach that, like in the last slide I showed you, would protect us from things like data drift, the mean changing, the cold start problem where you don't know what a number looks like at the beginning, but you need to kind of analyze it as the number starts presenting. And then also you need that context for immediate action. So you need to know what all those components say. You need to know what the context of other numbers are saying at the same time so that you can quickly infer what it is that happens. And then finally, as the cherry on the cake, we really want some kind of enterprise integration here. We want to be able to take this and be able to plug it into any other components in our enterprise, possibly through an API, so that if something has to happen downstream or other systems have to be called on when we know something has changed, then we can do that. So let's pop into a little demonstration of that. Again, we have Yellowfin here, and I'm just going to start out by going into what signals looks like right off the bat. This is the same data set that I was using to present that earlier. This is a signals feed. It's a component you can put on any dashboard to show a filtered set of signals, either from your own analysis or from a group, that will give you a quick summary of signals that have been recently found, and you can limit how many are shown. When you come into this and you say want to explore one of these signals a little bit further, you see a big spike in this, for example, we get an entire screen dedicated to give us that context. So the first thing I'll show you is that this is an adaptive algorithm. So if you say you want to watch it or you mark it as useful, you'll start to see more signals associated with these data points. And you get a text summation here, textual summation of what it is you're seeing, that for sales amount, there was a prolonged spike along this particular category. Even though the signal is here to monitor sales amount, the monitoring actually occurs on every different way that it can slice that by every dimension. That's where we become intractable for an analyst to do manually, and we really need some kind of automation under the hood. And so this is where I think that telecommunications example kind of fell short. When I finished my solution, the signals didn't exist yet, and we weren't able to actually go under the hood and slice it up by every dimension. Would have been a big loop of just kind of analyzing all that data. We talked about a few different ways to do it, but here it's entirely productized, and all you have to do is turn it on. And so when you see here what it does, it's very similar to that analysis I was showing. It's a holistic analysis of how the data is behaving. What's normal and what's weird is based on some statistical quantities it derives from the data. And then when the data does something out of profile, a sensitivity value that you can change, by the way, it will create a signal and let you know. And this is available through an API or available here directly, and will even, if you're watching it, will pop up on your timeline. There's analysis available. So if you've ever seen assisted insights, this is very similar to the technology behind that, where it will actually go find metrics that are associated with this signal and will show you what the context around contribution of variance, positive or negative, based on each one of these slices of the data, and it'll give you textual summaries of exactly what it found about those. So you can just read through this and very quickly get the sense that in this case, whiskeys in big box retail stores sold a lot more in this latest month here than they sold in the prior month, and that's what drove this signal. Setting a signal up, it does require special licensing from Yellowfin to enable signals, and you'll get that in your menu when that's enabled. And from there, you can go into monitoring and managing these signals. The different types of signals available, I will say, most people focus on outliers and things where they're popping. There are also period comparisons, which will show you periods from a current to a prior period, and you get to kind of select what you're making that period over period comparison with, and Yellowfin will just go off and slice it up and do that analysis in the background, as well as trend changes. So you're going up more aggressively, you're going down more aggressively, or your volatility is increased even if your average is the same. All of those kinds of analyses are available to you. And what I would recommend is when you have signals turned on, go take a look at the tutorial data, because there will be a couple available to you in there. And then you can just, if you want to see how they're set up, go in and copy them. And then you see the basic settings you're going to be able to apply here around the date range that you're looking at. Of course, in this one, it's a fixed date range that looks over a specific time period because it's demonstration data. However, you can make that a basic compare for a dynamically defined time range. So you can look for like the last year or the last 6 months or what have you. You pick the metrics that you want to monitor, what the default aggregation of those metrics are if you're looking at multiple records, and then the dimensions you want to slice them by in here. Naturally, the more dimensions you add to the slicing will multiply out the amount of time Yellowfin spends in the background analyzing this stuff, and you get to a point where you will make your processor very hot if you throw a lot of dimensions at it. So you really want to only throw what's useful. And then as a scaling strategy, obviously, you can grow the size of the server Yellowfin's running on, but Yellowfin will also scale this horizontally by through a clustering license, where you can actually deploy multiple Yellowfin nodes on a single solution, and each of them will share the processing of the signals. Finally, you have here the final set of advanced configuration changes, and that's where you get this sensitivity metric, along with several others I won't go through one by one. The text here is actually very descriptive of what they do, and there's lots of documentation online. But fundamentally, I always get this question about, can we make it more or less sensitive so we're seeing more or fewer signals? Yes, you can. Just use this to toggle, or not toggle, but rather slide higher or lower sensitivity in the detection of, what something unusual or out of profile has happened. And I think, great. All right, going back to our presentation then. Just as a final note, I'll kind of talk a little bit about what I see as ways you can get started on this. I have to say, this does seem like it is missed in terms of most of the organizations that I begin consulting with, even those that are really trying to get a handle on their analytics maturity and move forward. Most of them are not quite monitoring this, the data that they have available to capture those moments when they could have made a quick decision, or it would have given them a competitive advantage, and they miss key business opportunities when that data changes. So I think that if you really want to look at this as all of these maturity curves around analytics and data that you see out there, they all end in this place of more predictability, more evidence-based decisioning, more context in those decisions, more evidence available. And that as soon as you start profiling your data in this way, whether you're doing it with a coded 30% jump or drop, or you're doing it with something more holistic like signals and then slicing it up and providing all that context, you are absolutely improving your maturity in terms of your analytics capability and competency. You can do that very quickly with these tools. And so I see it as very low-hanging fruit to get a lot of value in. And of course, when I go into company after company and I see they're not taking advantage of some of these things, or they don't have systems around how to monitor some of these things, I think it's a real missed opportunity, because it is within such easy reach, especially for these organizations that are aiming high and really looking at what's the next AI application, how do we incorporate these machine learning and more advanced analytics into the operations of our business, this is one that is within fairly easy reach, especially if you're using Yellowfin. The standard here really being, if you want to set it for yourselves, recognizing that data behaving abnormally, recognize when data is doing something out of profile. Back to that quote, don't let something that you think an assumption about your business that changes go unnoticed. And you use robots to do that. You use these under the hood kind of in silico operations in a platform like Yellowfin in order to stay on top of that stuff and then act according to its context. Okay, so I will at this point stop there and turn it over to questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it in. And I will answer as they come in. And let's see, I'm just trying to pull them up. All right. If there aren't any questions, then I'll go ahead and give it another minute. And if we don't have questions today, then we can join in next time. All right, no questions today. Okay, well, thanks everybody for joining. I look forward to seeing you next time in our next Ask Me Anything. You'll take care.